Welcome to the first installment of a series on this iconic engine format with a deep-rooted race heritage. Today, I'll tell you what it is, the history of it, what I plan to do with it, and we're going to tear it down to find out exactly what was wrong with it almost 50 years ago. So be sure to stay tuned. The 302 cubic inch GMC Inline 6 was produced from 1952 to 1960 when it was replaced by the V6. It had a square bore-to-stroke ratio of 4x4 inch and was the largest raised deck engine at the time. It was originally designed for the GMC military 2.5-ton trucks and up and was paired with a hydromatic transmission. They were quite specialized, however. The engine was a sealed engine for submersible use, had an electronic fuel pump and other features such as a deep sump oil pan. From 52 to 59, GMC manufactured the civilian version, which was not sealed, had a mechanical fuel pump, and used a standard size oil pan. Power listed in 59 was 160 horsepower and 268 foot-pounds of torque at only 1,600 RPM. The engine was very popular with hot rod enthusiasts because it produced tremendous power for an inline 6 at the time. It's built with a heavy cast block, can take a tremendous amount of abuse. Many of them were pulled from fire trucks and dump trucks. Finding one today is quite a tough task. Most aren't aware that back in the day, GMC and Chevy were not the same trucks. The only shared item between this engine and a Chevy is the rocker arm shaft. The GMC block was nearly indestructible, capable of being bored as much as 125 thou oversize with tremendous increases in compression ratio. It makes it a fantastic format for a vintage hot rod. About 50 years ago, this one was removed from a fire truck, in fact, and it belonged to the volunteer fire department in Kentucky and has sat in a fireman's basement until I picked it up. As I was told, it only has about 25,000 miles on it, but it dropped a cylinder. Fortunately, it's not locked up. However, I have no idea what I will find once I tear it down. So today, let's tear it down and find out. Here's a point where you can actually get a lot of clues. So here's a little tech tip. If you're thinking about buying an old engine, there's a lot of small things that you can look for to kind of give you an idea of what the internal condition of it is. Of course, if you can turn it over by hand is one thing. If you've got a bore scope, you can look down in the cylinders and get an idea there, but you still don't know. All of your freeze plugs all the way down. If you see a lot of rust coming out of a particular area here, sometimes you can even see if your block is cracked, you'll see an excessive amount of rust and drain where antifreeze has discolored the block. All the freeze plugs are flush with the side of the block, which means more than likely it hasn't frozen. An interesting thing about these engines, it took quite a gifted tuner to be able to get these engines to run really, really well. And it's because of how the cylinder layout is done. So if you notice, you'll have square port, round port, square port, round port, square port, round port, square port. All right, they have what's called Siamesed ports. Now, for example, in this port here, what you have is an exhaust port. Here you have an intake port that's actually split. Okay, so you have two intake valves here, then you have two exhaust valves here, two intake valves, two exhaust valves, two intake valves, and one exhaust valve. So in the tuning aspect of it, and especially with a single carburetor layout like all of these came with, you know, the carburetor was mounted here. So typically what would happen, because of the firing order, is this cylinder would be rich, these cylinders here and here would be lean. Because again, it's having to split cylinder. Now, some old drag race tricks back in the day, if you built a manifold, then you could go in and actually inside the intake manifold, split it off and almost run a split runner intake. Now, another trick is to actually come in here and put a small hump inside there to help split that fuel up. All right, another way to do it is when you make a manifold is to not run dual carbs, actually run triples, like some, you know, Strombergs, side draft Webers, something like that. And what you would do with your manifold is run an independent carb for each one of these. And that allows you to manage your front and rear and get the power balance done really well. Now, I'm still curious as to what we're going to find, because I've seen a lot of great things on the inside of the parts that I've taken off that make me feel pretty good. So one example was I looked at the drive lobe on the fuel pump. It looks clean. It doesn't look worn. Doesn't look gouged. When I pulled the distributor, I looked at the drive gear on the distributor for the oil pump and also the gear for the cam, and it did not look worn. It hardly looked worn at all. Hardly looked scarred. So far, we might get lucky and actually have a pretty good cam in this thing. Now, trying to get some clues also along the way, I don't see any signs along here that we've had a leaking head gasket. Of course, we see some oil and things everywhere, but again, I don't see an excessive amount of anything irregular as I work my way all the way around the head. So hopefully our deck surface is good here on both the head and the block. One clue that I do have, looking at each exhaust and intake valve, remember all we think we know about this engine is that it dropped a cylinder. All right, looking at the condition of each valve and the valve stem, each one of them has exactly the same coloration, you know, comparing intake to exhaust, except for one. The one back here in the back, I'm going to get a close-up for you in a second. Our exhaust valve back here in the back is essentially white. Now, remembering that this engine came out of a fire truck. Fire trucks spend an enormous amount of time idling. The other thing we have to remember is that our water pump is here. And how all of that goes through the block, this is going to be our hottest cylinder. So my prediction is that the only thing wrong with this engine is a burnt exhaust valve in the rear. So let's keep our fingers crossed. All the stuff is off. Now we get down to the belly of the beast. So hang in there with me. Okay, the head is off. Let's flip it over and see what we find. Just looking at the top, looking at each of the valve stems, man, they hardly have any wear on them at all. I don't see any problems at all with the retainers. I don't see any broken springs whatsoever. I'm going to show you the inside of the engine case here in just a second. Man, I just don't see anything here. I don't see any signs of cracks. I don't see, you know, any antifreeze or anything like that. So let's spin her over and have a look. Now we're going to take a very close look at the head gasket. Man, I don't see any carbon tracking between the cylinders at all. But look at this valve. The valve is off the seat slightly down here in the bottom corner. I'm still going to hold to my same prediction. We're going to take a look at the block, take a look at the pistons, cylinder skirt condition. Looking at this, I believe we've got a burnt valve right here in this corner. I believe that's our problem, folks. If we pull the head gasket, I don't see any carbon tracking whatsoever between the cylinders. We had a good head gasket seal. I don't see any signs of coolant. Man, awesome, awesome, awesome. I think that is our problem right there. Let's take a look at the block. Okay, as I said before, you know, these are 4-inch stroke, 4-inch bore cylinders. Now, I decided to go through and measure each cylinder, and each one is slightly different. And of course, I'm not using a dial bore gauge. There's no need. Remember that I'd mentioned that these blocks could be bored up to 125 thousandths over. So as long as I'm considerably less than that, I'm fine. So I'm not hooking up a dial bore gauge or anything like that. So just using a dial caliper here. I'm at 4-inch, 12 thou, plus or minus a little because of some carbon buildup. I'm at 20 thou oversized there, 10 thou oversized there, 20 thou oversize, roughly probably 15 to 20 oversize. There's some carbon buildup because these blocks back when these things were cast, the castings were not all that great as far as precision anyway. So it wasn't uncommon for blocks to come out of the factory oversized, 10 thou, 20 thou over. What I'm finding interesting though is that while this block is on average 20 thou over per cylinder, typically what you would find if the block came out of the factory oversized, before there's a number on the side of the engine, and the first 3 digits are the engine displacement, which would be 302. If the engine were oversized from the factory for the bore size, there would be an indication before the 302, a letter designation telling you that it was oversized. Also, I do know that from the factory, the mains and rod bearings are larger than original spec, because also on that original number stamped on the side of the block, there's an E designation. From memory, I believe that means that the rod bearings are 10 thou undersize and the main bearings are standard. I would have to look at my chart on that. It's been a long time since I've messed with one of these. But anyway, it does have that E designation at the end. So if any of you guys watching are into these 302s, you remember what that E means, if you could help me out, put in the comments below there what that is. But I'm pretty certain E, as in Edward, is either undersized main bearings, rod bearings, or a variation of the two. It does turn over nicely, but with the pistons being at about, feels roughly about 5 thousandths below deck, that's and then these are I have to say obviously stock pistons. So if with it being 5 thou below deck, that's another indication that that the block has never been decked. But when I look at the top of the deck, I still see great things. I see no traces of any type of head gasket leak here up here at all, either through compression from one cylinder to the other. I don't see any signs of any coolant getting into the cylinder, and when I rotate the engine over, it rotates over incredibly easily. I don't hear any type of knocking noise or anything like that. So let's spin it over here. So it spins over nicely. I'm very pleased to see that the cylinder walls are in fantastic condition. This engine has never been locked up. I'm still, considering its age and how long it's been sitting, astounded at how great the cylinders look. There's also no indication on the top of the cylinders that that one cylinder was running excessively lean compared to the other. They all have similar carbon buildup on top of the pistons. The top of the pistons underneath the carbon here look great. There's no metal missing. There's no pitting, so that tells me there wasn't a tremendous amount of detonation or anything in this engine. That's going to sum it up for the first installment of the rebuild of this 302 Inline 6 GMC engine. Next time we come back for this series, we're going to pull the oil pan, we're going to pull the cam cover, pull the cams, we're going to pull the pistons, pull the crank, measure the mains and rod bearings, and at that point we'll know the overall condition of this engine. But so far I am thrilled and excited, so please like, subscribe if you are interested. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.